And welcome to a new live lesson, a new live session from your channel Pure English. I always make sure that the title of the live stream is indicative of the topic being discussed in it. So as the topic of today's live lesson dictates, today's live session will be split into two sections. The first section will be how to talk about exceptions in English, how to refer to an exception or to exceptions in the English language. This will be the first section of our live session today. And the second part or the second half of the live lesson today will be holding a comparison between two words which are quite similar in English, and these are the words between and among. So without further ado, let's get started. But before we get started, I always call on you, my dear viewers, my dear audience, to interact with the content if it appeals to you. So if you like this content and if you are willing to subscribe to the channel, that would be great. I am trying to grow the channel and to make sure that the channel expands and reach new audience, a new sector of viewers. So please, if you like the content, make sure that you interact with the videos being recorded or live through liking them, sharing them if they are appealing to you, not to mention subscribing to the channel and leaving down any comments in the comments box if you want to suggest something or leave a remark. Right, so as I said a couple of minutes ago, today's live lesson will be split into two sections. The first section will be dedicated to how to talk about exceptions in English. And the second part of the live lesson will be tackling a comparison between two similar words in the English language, and these are between and among. So there are several words in English which can be used to talk about exceptions. And the most famous phrase or the most famous expression or word used for that purpose is the word except. And as a matter of fact, there's another expression called except for, which is quite similar to the expression except. So this means that usually or normally, except on one side and except for on the other side are interchangeable, meaning that you can use any of the two expressions with no difference in meaning. So the first point I'm making here in today's live session is that except on one side and except for on the other side are both interchangeable, meaning that in most of the cases, typically, you can use or utilize any of them in your spoken English or in your written English. However, let me also tell you that except is more generic than except for, which means that there are some cases in which you cannot use except for and you are forced or obliged to use except. So what are these cases? If you are using the word for exception, being except or except for, if you are using it before an infinitive, you cannot use except for. If you are using it before a that clause, you cannot use except for. If you are using it before a preposition, you cannot use except for. Right. So we're talking here about three cases in which except is the only possible option, which means that you cannot use except for. Let me reiterate the three cases again for you. So what I was saying is you can use except or except for interchangeably, meaning that both of them usually work. But in these particular three cases, only except is usable and except for cannot be used. These three situations are before infinitives being a bare infinitive or a base form, or being a to infinitive or a full infinitive, that's the infinitive preceded by the word to, So before infinitives, whether your infinitive is a bare infinitive or a to infinitive, you cannot use except for. This is the first case. The second case is before a that clause. If you have a that clause following the exception word, you cannot use except for, and you need to use except. And the third case is using a preposition after the exception expression. So let me give you some examples in which except and except for are interchangeable, meaning that you can use any of them correctly, and then give you further examples for the cases in which only except is possible and except for isn't. So let's begin with this example. The example says, the price of the holiday includes all meals except lunch. Again, the price of the holiday includes all meals except lunch. Well, what is the word after except here? It's lunch. Lunch is a noun, so except for is usable, because having a noun after the exception expression is not one of the three cases. So we can also say that the price of the holiday includes all meals except for lunch. So in this particular example, both options except and except for are usable because they are followed by a noun, and it's okay to have a noun after except for. Let me give you another example. Everyone seemed to have been invited except Mrs. Woodford. Again, everybody or everyone seemed to have been invited except Mrs. Woodford. So what's coming after the exception expression? It's a noun, which is Mrs. Woodford. That's a proper noun. And as we said in the previous example, it's okay to have a noun after except for. So in this example also, you can use either except or except for. So you can use also except for by saying, everyone seemed to have been invited except for Mrs. Woodford. Let's have another example. I had no money to give him except for the few coins in my pocket, or except the few coins in my pocket. So as you can see, what follows the exception expression is a noun phrase, which is the few coins in my pocket. And you can have a noun phrase after except for, which means that also in this specific example, you can use either except or except for. So you can say, I had no money to give him except the few coins in my pocket, or I had no money to give him except for the few coins in my pocket. Right, now let's tackle some examples which show the cases in which except for cannot be used, because the exception expression is followed either by a that clause or an infinitive or a preposition. For example, I rarely need to go into the city center except to do some shopping. Again, I rarely need to go to the city center except to do some shopping. After except, we have a to infinitive, which is to do. So we cannot use except for in this example. And the only possible option is except, and we say, I rarely need to go into the city center except, not except for, except to do some shopping. Another example. They look just like the real thing, except that they are made of plastic. Again, they look just like the real thing, except that they are made of plastic. So what follows the exception expression here is the that clause, because the sentence says, except that they are made of plastic. So having a that clause after except makes it impossible to use except for, and we must use only except in this example. Another case, we can say, there is nothing more the doctor can do except keep an eye on him. Again, there is nothing more the doctor can do except keep an eye on him. So what's following except is the bare infinitive keep. So we cannot use except for in this example because except for cannot be used before infinitives being bare infinitives or two infinitives. One last example to highlight this case. There is likely to be rain everywhere today except in Wales. Again, there is likely to be rain everywhere today except in Wales. So as you can see, after except we have a preposition, and our preposition here is in. And because we have a preposition after except, we cannot use except for, which means that the only possible option in this case is except. So this sums up this point by saying that except and except for are normally interchangeable. You can use any of them except in three cases. If after except you have a preposition or an infinitive or a that clause, in these three cases, except for is not possible and only except can be used. Right. There is also a word which is relevant to the topic, and that word is called besides. Do not confuse besides with beside. Beside, without the S at the end, is a preposition of place. When you say that something is beside something, this means it's next to it. They are next to each other. They are beside each other. But besides means in addition to or as well as. Besides, which ends in the S, is used as a conjunction, which means that it connects ideas within sentences. So besides means in addition to or means as well as. Let me give you an example highlighting the word besides. Besides cricket, I enjoy watching football and basketball. Again, besides cricket, which means in addition to cricket or as well as cricket, I enjoy watching football and basketball, right? Another example. Besides her novels and poems, she published a number of short stories. Besides her poems and novels, which means in addition to or as well as her poems and novels, she also published a number of short stories. So as you could see in these couple of examples, that the word besides, which as I said is a conjunction, not a preposition, the preposition version of it is beside, which doesn't end in an S. But the one ending in an S, which is besides, is used as a conjunction, and it means in addition to or as well as. Right. Another word or another phrase which is highly relevant to talking about exception is the phrase apart from. Apart from means except or besides. So be careful with that. This phrase apart from has two meanings. It can be used with the meaning of except. So apart from can be used as a synonym to except, or apart from can be used as a synonym to besides. Let's have some examples. I can say, I don't enjoy watching any sports apart from tennis. Again, I don't enjoy watching any sports apart from tennis. So apart from here means except tennis. So I can omit apart from and replace it with except or except for, because we have tennis after it, which is a noun, and except for, as we said earlier, can be used before nouns. So in this example, we can say, I don't enjoy watching any sports except tennis, or except for tennis, or apart from tennis. But we can also have apart from with the meaning of in addition to, or besides. Like in this example, apart from tennis, I enjoy watching rugby and swimming. Again, apart from tennis, I enjoy watching rugby and swimming. So this means that in addition to watching rugby and swimming, or besides watching rugby and swimming, I also enjoy watching tennis. So as you could see in these two examples, apart from has two meanings. It can be used with the meaning of except or except for, and it can be also used with the meaning of besides or in addition to or as well as. One of the important words used to talk about exceptions as well is the word but. Actually, but, which is spelled B-U-T, can be used with the meaning of except. So in some contexts or in some sentences, you might bump into or come across or run into the word but used with the meaning of except. Let's have an example. There was no way out but upwards, towards the light. Again, there was no way out but upwards, which means that there was no way out except for upwards or except upwards. So using but in this sense or in this context means that it has the same meaning of except. So as we could see, we can replace but with except by saying there was no way out except upwards, or there was no way out but upwards, meaning that the only way possible there was in the upward direction towards the light. But be careful that but has a different meaning from but for. But for means thanks to or because of. So let's have a couple of examples here highlighting this phrase but for. I've got there on time except for the taxi being late, or but for the taxi being late. So I could have got there on time. I could have got there on time but for the taxi being late, which means except for the taxi being late. So except for that particular reason or cause, I was delayed. I couldn't reach my destination on time. So but for means that only because of that thing the action was done or the action was not done. Let's have another example. The country would have been self-sufficient in food now but for the drought of last year. Again, the country would have been self-sufficient in food now but for the drought of last year. So only because of the drought of last year the country isn't self-sufficient in food now. The last point I want to make regarding the first section of today's live lesson is a couple of formal expressions. You can use the words excepted or aside or apart after mentioning a person or a thing to say that this person or thing is not included in the statement we're making. Again, in a formal context, if your register is formal, if you're writing something formal, or if you're making a formal speech, you can use any of these words, apart or aside or accepted, after a person or a thing, after the name of a person or a thing, to say that this person or that thing is not included, is an exception to the statement you're saying or the statement you're making. Let me give you two examples to highlight this. It has been 1984 accepted the hottest July for the last 100 years. Again, it has been 1984 or 1984 accepted the hottest July for the last 100 years. So you can use accepted or apart or aside. So you could say it has been 1984, accepted or apart or aside. It was the hottest July over the last 100 years. Another example. Tom had difficulties with question 2. Tom was doing an exam, apparently, was solving a test, and he had difficulties with question 2. This accepted or this aside or this apart, he did very well in the exam. So, over the course of the last 20 minutes, since the beginning of the live stream until now, we have covered talking about exceptions in English using several expressions. We talked primarily about words like except for. We also talked about but and but for. We talked about besides and apart from. And we talked about the formal expressions, which are somebody or something, followed by accepted or apart or aside. Now, and as the title of the live stream dictates, we shall be moving to the second section of today's live session, and that's a comparison between the two words between and among. Well, the two words are pretty similar, and in some contexts they are interchangeable, which means that you can use either of them correctly. But the differentiator here is the number of people or things we're referring to. Between is used to refer to two or more items, whereas among is used to refer to three or more items. So the minimum number that we can use with between is two people or two things, whereas with among, the minimum number we can refer to is three. So among cannot be used when we are referring to two people or two things only. Among needs to be used with a number of items that exceeds to three or more. Another fundamental difference or distinction between the two words is how we regard these people or these things. So if we regard the people or the things we're referring to as separate items, it's preferable to use between. But if we regard them as a single unit, it's preferable to use among. So let me give you some examples highlighting between and among. Let's begin with between. She held the diamond between her thumb and forefinger, like that. So she held the diamond between her thumb, this finger, and her forefinger, this one. So because we're talking here about two items only, or two things, the thumb and the forefinger, it's also called the index finger, because we're referring only to two things, we use between. So we say that she held the diamond between her thumb and her forefinger, and we cannot say among her thumb and forefinger. Right. Another example. Zimbabwe, and that's a country in Africa, Zimbabwe is situated, which means is located, between Zambia to the north, Mozambique to the east, Botswana to the west, and South Africa to the south. Well, here, although we're referring to four items, and these are the four countries surrounding Zimbabwe in Africa, in the southern part of Africa, we're referring to four items here, but we regard them as separate items because they refer to four separate countries. So we used between, although it's four items. Again, Zimbabwe is situated, is located between Zambia to the north, Mozambique to the east, Botswana to the west, and South Africa to the south. Well, so we use we use between if we are referring to two people or two things, like in the example of holding the diamond between the thumb and the index finger or the forefinger. or if we regard the number of people or things we're referring to as separate items. On the other hand, we use among only if the items we're referring to are at least three. You can't use among when you're referring to two people or two things. In addition, when you use among, it means that you regard the group of people or the group of things you're referring to as a single unit, not as separate items. For example, he stood among his friends in the room and felt very happy. Again, he stood among his friends in the room and felt very happy. Well, we don't regard his friends here as separate people. We regard them as a single unit representing his friends. So we use among because we are regarding his friends as a single unit. So we say, he stood among his friends in the room and he felt really happy. We can also have another example highlighting the usage of the word among, and the example says, she eventually found her passport among her clothes in the drawer. Again, she eventually found her passport among her clothes in the drawer. So we regard her clothes here as a single item, not as separate items, but as a single unit. So we refer to them using among rather than between. There is a literary or a formal alternative to among, and that's called amongst. Amongst. It's just the word among with S and T added to its end. Using amongst is common if we are talking in a formal context or in a literary context. Literary means something relating to literature. You can find that in classic English, old novels, old poetry, and so forth. So amongst can be used as an alternative to among with all the rules applicable to it, with all the grammar of it similar or identical to the grammar of among. The only distinction is that amongst is considered to be more literary or more formal than using among. But there are some special expressions or some fixed expressions in which we use between or among. For example, when I say between ourselves or between you and me, so when I say that this thing is between ourselves or between you and me, this means it's something that's considered a secret between the two of us. So if I precede something that I'm saying to you, if I precede that with the phrase between ourselves or between you and me, this means that I want you to keep it as a secret. You don't tell anyone about it. For example, between ourselves or between you and me, I don't think Tom was honest in his account. Account here means a story. So if someone gives an account of something, it means that they are telling a story about it. So between ourselves or between you and me, which means as a secret, don't tell anyone what I'm telling you right now. Between you and me, I think Tom wasn't honest or was dishonest in his account or in the story that he told us. So this is an expression, a special expression that's used with the word between. We also have a couple of expressions used with among. For example, there is an expression which is called among others. Among others. This expression can be used to refer to people or things. For example, I'll give you an example to highlight this expression. Among others, yeah. The concert features, among others, Carl Frisk and the Johnsons. Again, so the concert features, among others, Carl Frisk and the Johnsons. So this means that Carl Frisk and the Johnsons are just two of all the other stars, bands or singers or performers featured in the concert. So as you could see, among others in this example is used to refer to people. It can also be used to refer to things, right? It can be used to refer to things, or you can just say among other things. For example, you can say, I later found out that he had been a carpenter and a dustman, among others, or among other things. Again, I later discovered, or I later found out that he had been a carpenter and a dustman, among other things, or among others. So as you could see, these three special expressions are featuring among in two expressions of them, among others to refer to people or things, or among other things to refer to things, whereas we also tackled or addressed or handled a special expression that includes the word between, and that's between ourselves or between you and me, and we usually introduce something that we want to keep as a secret, or we want you to keep as a secret. We're sharing it with you, but we want you to keep it as a secret. So before we say it or before we tell you that thing, we introduce it with saying between ourselves or between you and me. So this was today's live session. It was split into two parts. The first part was devoted to talking about exceptions and how to do that in English, and we addressed several expressions like except for, apart from, besides, but for, among others. And we also, in the second half or the second section of today's live lesson, we tackled a comparison between the two words, between and among, and also we handled some of the special expressions which feature these two words. I hope the content appeals to you. If it does, please feel free to interact with the content through liking it, through subscribing to the channel, or leaving some comments in the comments box, whether you're suggesting something or making a remark. Also, I'd really appreciate it if you shared this content with your family members and friends for the channel to grow and for the community to get bigger, because I'm still starting the channel. I have just uploaded about 40 something videos so far, so the channel is still taking off the ground, as they say in the idiom. And as I always say, I present lots of different types of aspects of English here. So I do grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, tips for improving the skills of the English language, being writing, reading, speaking, or listening. So I guess that this channel is very useful and is so instrumental, and it will come in handy for all the learners of the language, whether they are using English for study at school or at university, if they need English for their professional life at work, or even if they are trying to immigrate to an English-speaking country in which they have to master a good command of English to be able to communicate with natives over there. I don't want to bore you with more than that today. I think we've had enough. We've covered the two lessons that we wanted to cover, talking about exceptions in English and talking about the comparison between, among, and between. Our next live lesson, which will probably be tomorrow, we will be talking about the two main types of prepositions in English, and these are prepositions of place and prepositions of time. For now, I'd like to thank you very much for your attentive listening. Please enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you in our next live lesson. Have a great day and goodbye.